The clock is ticking. You feel it every single time you open your utility bill, every time you fill your gas tank, every time you look at the absurd, unattainable price tag of a starter home. They tell you it's temporary. They parrot the word transitory. They blame supply chains, a pandemic, or some far-flung geopolitical skirmish. That right there is the official narrative. That is the lie. The big reveal? The engineered collapse of the dollar. What if the relentless, agonizing rise in the cost of living isn't a market accident? What if it's not a temporary glitch in the complex machine of global finance? The truth is darker, more cynical, and infinitely more important to your survival. The devaluation of the dollar is the deliberate, inevitable endpoint of a secret financial mechanism that has been operating outside of government and regulatory control for over 60 years. You are watching your life savings, your retirement fund, and the purchasing power of your wages being systematically burned away. This isn't due to incompetence. It's due to an engineered, structural process of liquidation. The money supply that dictates the value of every single dollar in your wallet is not controlled by the official who speaks at the press conference. It's controlled by a shadow system that operates in the high-rise offices of London, in the opaque vaults of Zurich, and in a global network of untraceable offshore accounts. This shadow financial structure has been silently creating trillions of dollars that the Federal Reserve cannot track, cannot audit, and cannot control. And here is the critical pivot point. This shadow system has just crossed its critical threshold. The dollar devaluation you're experiencing right now is not simple inflation as defined by the history books. It is the inevitable systemic release of an estimated $30+ trillion in unchecked, unbacked offshore debt. This financial singularity will result in the permanent reset of domestic purchasing power, a silent, bloodless confiscation of wealth, fulfilling the shadow banker's ultimate goal of liquidating sovereign and corporate debt through engineered inflation. That is the hidden truth. That is the big reveal that the central banks and the financial media will never, ever admit. The dollar isn't just losing value. It is reaching the breaking point of a decades-in-the-making colossal offshore debt bomb. We are going to give you the 3 non-negotiable assets you must own before this collapse reaches its critical phase. But first, you must understand the weapon being used against you. This is not investment advice. This is a survival guide. This is the unfiltered, unvarnished truth. Before we dive into the mechanics of your financial defense, take a second. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button right now because every video we release from this point forward will be dedicated to exposing this pattern and detailing the concrete steps you need to take to protect your family from the coming financial winter, the shadow system. Understanding the Eurodollar. The official narrative tells us the world's financial system is managed by the IMF, the World Bank, and the Federal Reserve. This is the official stage play. The reality is that the real global money supply, the vast multi-trillion-dollar ocean of credit that finances all global trade, all sovereign debt, and all major corporate leverage, lives in a dark, unregulated corner known as the Eurodollar System. This shadow economy, which began as a geopolitical necessity, has metastasized into the primary source of the world's financial instability and the ultimate mechanism for the destruction of your purchasing power. A birth of fear and greed. This system was born from a potent mix of fear and greed in the 1950s. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and other major foreign institutions were terrified to hold their dollar reserves in U.S. banks, fearing the American government might seize those assets as a political maneuver. So they started depositing those dollar reserves in banks outside the United States, primarily in London. These dollars, held in European banks, hence the name Eurodollars, were suddenly free of direct U.S. regulation, free of reserve requirements, and free of the Federal Reserve's direct control. A Eurodollar is simply a dollar-denominated deposit outside the United States. This sounds benign, but this simple geographic relocation triggered the greatest, most catastrophic expansion of unchecked credit in human history. The magic of zero reserve. When a dollar is deposited in a U.S. bank, the Fed mandates that a certain percentage of that dollar must be kept in reserve. This acts as a crucial, necessary check on credit creation. When that dollar moves to the Eurodollar market in London, the foreign bank holding it is subject only to the laxer regulations of its host nation. Often, these had zero reserve requirements. What does zero reserve mean in practice? It means the foreign bank can lend out 100% of that dollar, and the borrower can then deposit that dollar in another offshore bank, which can, in turn, lend out 100% of that dollar again, and so on. This unchecked exponential fractional reserve process led to a geometric, explosive expansion in the global supply of credit, all denominated in dollars, but created entirely outside the purview of the American Monetary Authority. This system allowed global financial institutions, the shadow banks, the biggest investment houses, the most powerful foreign central banks, to create vast amounts of dollar-denominated credit that simply did not exist on the Federal Reserve (AUN's) official balance sheet. It birthed a colossal, invisible shadow money supply, an ocean of debt far, far larger than the officially recorded M2. By the 1970s, this Eurodollar system was already the primary engine financing global trade, corporate debt, and sovereign lending. The Fed was effectively neutered on the world stage. They controlled the domestic money supply, but the global money supply, the part that dictated the price of oil, the price of gold, international corporate leverage, and sovereign debt, was completely opaque and beyond their regulatory grasp. This is the central financial fraud that underlies our current crisis. The devaluation you feel today is not the simple result of domestic spending on infrastructure or COVID relief. It is the involuntary tightening and subsequent liquidity explosion of this vast, invisible offshore dollar debt market. When this shadow system seizes, as it did with terrifying clarity in 2008, and as it is doing with persistent cruelty now, the Fed has only one inevitable response: print furiously to cover the shadow liabilities, accelerating the big reveal and sacrificing your purchasing power. The story of the Eurodollar system is the story of how the world ambitious financial elite built an economic mechanism outside of any sovereign control, granting themselves the power to create money out of thin air, and leaving the American taxpayer to absorb the inflationary consequence. This is the invisible weapon driving the dollar toward its inevitable reset. We are no longer talking about mere economic policy. We are talking about engineered structural collapse, cycles of sacrifice, the historical roadmap. The history of the Eurodollar system is not a random series of accidents. It is a clear, repeating cyclical pattern of massive, unchecked credit expansion, followed by an inevitable catastrophic implosion, each time demanding a larger, more destructive bailout from the U.S. taxpayer. The pattern is as simple as it is destructive. Greed creates shadow debt. The shadow debt explodes. The Fed covers the explosion with fiat currency. The conventional history of financial crises, the savings and loan crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the Russian default, the dot-com bubble, even the great financial crisis of 2008, are all typically framed as domestic accidents or regional market failures. This is the silver screen distortion that covers the real mechanism. The reality is that every one of these crises was fundamentally an offshore liquidity event stemming from the Eurodollar system. They were symptoms of an overarching systemic failure to control the global dollar supply. Let's look at the historical parallels, the roadmap to our present crisis. The LDC debt crisis, 1970s. In the mid-1970s, the Eurodollar system was already beginning to show its teeth. Foreign banks, operating without reserve requirements, had lent enormous amounts of Eurodollars to developing nations, leading to the sovereign debt crisis that plagued Latin America. The debt was originated outside U.S. regulation and pushed aggressively. When those nations began to default, the entire system, the offshore banks, the foreign governments, the global financial elite, looked to one entity for salvation: the U.S. Federal Reserve. Does this sound familiar? A vast, interconnected web of unbacked debt, created by greedy institutions outside of any national control, threatens to seize the global system, and the U.S. taxpayer is the only guaranteed backstop. The crisis was framed as an LDC debt crisis, a problem of Mexican or Brazilian mismanagement. The reality was a problem of Eurodollar liquidity. The Fed stepped in, orchestrating rescues, ultimately backstopping the trillions in offshore debt and inflating the domestic money supply slightly to cover the risk. This was the first major inflationary sacrifice made to protect the shadow system. The Asian financial crisis, 1997-1998. Again, the official narrative focused on crony capitalism in Thailand or currency mismanagement in Indonesia. The hidden truth was the explosive growth of Eurodollar-denominated short-term loans across Asian economies. Global financial institutions poured unbacked Eurodollars into these nations. When investor confidence wavered, the short-term debts couldn't be rolled over and the entire system seized. The problem was not the local currencies. The problem was the global demand for physical dollars to repay the Eurodollar debt. Sound familiar yet? Unregulated foreign debt, created by global banks chasing high yield, triggered a regional collapse that threatened to cascade worldwide. The Fed, led by Alan Greenspan, had to inject massive liquidity and orchestrated global bailouts to keep the shadow system from imploding. The cost was paid not by the shadow bankers, but by the subtle, persistent devaluation of the dollar that followed. Every single time the Eurodollar system nearly fails, the U.S. central bank must print more currency to inject into the offshore system, diluting the wealth of every American. The global financial crisis, 2008, the peak historical proof. We were told the crisis was about bad domestic mortgages and CDOs. That's the official story, the small lie. The big lie was that the U.S. banks were collapsing because the global Eurodollar network had seized up. Foreign banks, central banks, and shadow institutions had hundreds of billions of dollars in off-balance sheet liabilities and required dollar funding that evaporated overnight. When Lehman Brothers failed, the problem wasn't merely the mortgages, it was that the entire offshore interbank lending market froze, creating a global shortage of the physical dollar needed to service the vast Eurodollar credit mountain. The Fed did not just bail out domestic banks. They executed massive secret currency swap lines with foreign central banks, over $580 billion in just 1 week, to inject physical US dollars into the offshore financial system. This was the most dramatic intervention in history to prevent the Eurodollar system from seizing entirely. An uncontrollable, opaque system of off-balance sheet debt created by global banking giants nearly collapses the world economy. The US central bank must print and inject trillions into the system, sacrificing the domestic currency's stability to save the global shadow network. The historical pattern is an unambiguous roadmap to the present crisis. The core lesson is that the global money supply is dictated by the velocity and integrity of the offshore shadow debt, not the Federal Reserve's domestic policy. We are now entering a new phase where the sheer volume of that shadow debt, now estimated to exceed $30 trillion, can no longer be masked by simple liquidity injections. The only option left is the structural devaluation of the currency itself. The mid-script twist. Who ceded control? You now understand the weapon, the Eurodollar system, the unbacked, uncontrolled ocean of dollar credit. You know the pattern: expand credit, crash, force Fed bailout, devalue domestic currency. But who created this monster, and why was the Fed so eager to lose control? The common assumption is that the Eurodollar system simply evolved due to market dynamics and Cold War fear. That is partially true, but its transformation from a niche market into the primary global financial system was engineered by one powerful entity that saw in its unregulated nature the ultimate tool for perpetual expansion. The entity saw the ability to create vast amounts of capital outside of any sovereign constraint as the future of financial power. The institution that catalyzed the transformation of the Eurodollar system from an obscure novelty into the global engine of shadow finance was not a government agency. It was the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. The BIS, often called the Central Bank of Central Banks, is an institution located in Basel, Switzerland, that operates entirely outside the direct political oversight of any single nation. It is the forum where central bankers meet, discuss policy, and crucially, coordinate global financial rules. And it was within this cloistered, opaque institution that the decision was made, or at least ratified and facilitated, to allow the Eurodollar system to thrive unregulated. Why? Because the Eurodollar system offered a way for the post-war financial system to recycle the immense amount of sovereign and trade dollars without the restrictive regulatory overhead of the US banking system. It offered global financial players a way to supercharge profits by operating on razor-thin or non-existent reserve requirements. The BIS, in its capacity as the convener of central banking orthodoxy, essentially provided the intellectual and political cover for the expansion of this shadow network, knowing full well it was removing the essential stabilizing mechanism, reserve requirements, from the global dollar supply. The true mid-script twist is the realization that the official central banking body intentionally ceded control of the global money supply, because the alternative, tight domestic regulation, would have constrained the profits of the global financial giants. They chose profit over control. The ultimate proof of the BIS's role is in their own data. They are the only entity that even attempts to track the offshore dollar funding gap, yet they only started compiling reliable data long after the system became dangerously complex. Their reports serve as the ultimate postmortem, documenting the massive scale of the shadow liabilities they permitted to accrue. The most shocking documentation, however, came from the U.S. Federal Reserve itself during the crisis of 2008. The Fed was forced to admit in congressional testimony that its primary response to the crisis was to inject physical dollars not just into U.S. banks, but into the foreign central banks who were exposed to the seizing Eurodollar system. The amount of the initial secretive liquidity injection, the currency swap lines, was initially hidden from the public. It took years of lawsuits and FOIA requests to force the Fed to release the full records of who received the emergency funding and how much. When the full data was finally released, it became the undeniable receipt for the financial fraud perpetuated against the American people. The names of the foreign institutions and the scope of the secret bailouts provided by the Fed to the offshore shadow network proved that the entire global system was in fact an appendage of the Eurodollar market, and the Fed was its unwilling yet compelled guarantor. The final piece of this puzzle is the name of the man who led the Federal Reserve during this critical period of unprecedented shadow debt creation and subsequent bailout, the figure who executed the largest injection of currency into the Eurodollar system in history. The documents prove he knew exactly what he was saving. The receipt is wilder than you think. The financial mechanics. Deep dive. The global dollar shortage. This is the core of the crisis. We must quantify the stakes and explain the unavoidable mechanics that guarantee dollar devaluation. The mechanism is simple, destructive, and hinges on what is called the global dollar shortage. The Eurodollar system, as established, creates dollar-denominated credit that far outpaces the Fed's physical dollar creation. Total shadow liabilities are currently estimated at well over $30 trillion, a figure that dwarfs the actual dollar reserves held by foreign central banks. This represents a massive unbacked financial obligation. Why hasn't it collapsed yet? Because the system relies entirely on rollover financing, the ability to continuously borrow new short-term Eurodollars to pay off old ones. It is a gigantic perpetual Ponzi scheme built entirely on trust. The crisis begins when that trust erodes and banks refuse to lend to each other. This is the global dollar shortage. The 4 steps to structural collapse. Step 1, credit contraction. The start of the seizure. A major global event, a regional war, pandemic, sovereign default, or banking failure, causes global lenders to withdraw capital. This halts the rollover process. Suddenly, institutions that need dollars to repay short-term Eurodollar debt cannot find them. The price of physical dollars skyrockets in offshore markets, draining liquidity from the entire global financial system. This scarcity creates a massive deflationary shock, threatening to freeze global trade and asset prices. Step 2, fire sale, forced liquidation. To obtain the dollars needed to repay debt, institutions are forced to liquidate assets, often selling U.S. Treasury bonds or high-quality stocks at fire sale prices. This drives down bond prices and triggers market crashes. Shocking stat number 1. In March 2020, the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield briefly plummeted to a historic low of 0.318%, signaling unprecedented offshore demand for physical dollars as the market seized up. Step 3. The Fed's inevitable choice, the sacrifice. The Federal Reserve observes the seizure and faces a stark reality. To prevent a total global collapse, it must inject physical dollars into the offshore system to cover the $30+ trillion gap. Essentially, the Fed becomes the lender of last resort for the entire world. Step 4, dollar devaluation, the big reveal. The only way the Fed can inject such massive liquidity without bankrupting the U.S. Treasury is to create new currency out of thin air. This unprecedented expansion of the domestic money supply, far larger than the domestic economy requires, is the only way to satisfy foreign shadow debt. The inevitable consequence is the destruction of the purchasing power of every domestic dollar holder. The inflation you experience is a direct result of the Eurodollar rescue mission. This pattern is driven by parasitic finance. The shadow banking system operates globally, profits by avoiding regulation, and forces the US dollar and the American public to absorb all the risk and inflationary costs. It is an engineered collapse disguised as a series of market events. Shocking stat number 2. During the 2008 crisis, Fed currency swap lines to foreign central banks reached $583 billion in a single week, nearly matching the original TARP bailout, much of it going to European institutions, heavily exposed to the Eurodollar market. The crisis of the 2020s confirmed this pattern. The Fed launched massive QE and maintained ZIRP to fill the void caused by offshore contraction. Shocking. Stat 3. The Fed AS total balance sheet expanded from approximately $4.1 trillion in February 2020 to nearly $9 trillion in April 2022, an unprecedented $4.9 trillion liquidity injection, largely to cover global dollar shortfalls. The system is now beyond repair. Shadow liabilities are simply too large. Shocking. Stat number 4. Estimates suggest that dollar-denominated debt outside the U.S. is now over 50% larger than the entire U.S. GDP. This moral hazard is the ultimate lesson. Institutions operate with absolute greed and recklessness because they know the U.S. dollar and the American worker will always absorb the inflationary cost. This devaluation is not temporary. It is a structural reset designed to liquidate $30+ trillion in unchecked liabilities. Shocking. Stat 5. Since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the dollar has lost over 97% of its purchasing power, with the sharpest acceleration occurring after the gold standard was abandoned in 1971. The next seizure will require a liquidity injection far larger than $4.9 trillion, guaranteeing hyperinflationary conditions. Final warning, the path to protection. The Eurodollar system is the global financial engine, and it is now redlining. Stakes are no longer measured in interest rates or market corrections, but in the preservation of your economic future. Denial is the most expensive mistake. When the next global financial event, a sovereign default, war escalation, or failure of a systemically important bank occurs, the collapse will be blindingly fast. Modern finance runs on instant digital transfers and algorithmic trading. When the next dollar shortage hits, it will trigger an instantaneous liquidity black hole demanding a rescue far exceeding any previous QE effort. The philosophical lesson is simple. The institutions running the system survive only as long as people believe the lie that the system is sound. Stop believing it, and the shadow system collapses. Your protection must be built on exiting the fiat debt system. The assets you need are those that cannot be printed, manipulated by the Eurodollar system, or censored by centralized authority. The 3 non-negotiable assets you must own. 1. Gold, the asset of last resort. The defense. Gold is the world's oldest, most universally accepted monetary metal. It carries no counterparty risk, no jurisdiction risk, and crucially, no printing risk. It is the perfect hedge against the central bank's inevitable final decision to print to cover the Eurodollar liabilities. It is the only asset with a proven track record of maintaining purchasing power across millennia of fiat currency collapses. Shutterstock acquisition strategy. Own physical gold, bars, coins, and store it in secure non-bank vaults or in a segregated, secure location you control. Avoid paper gold, ETFs, futures, as these carry the very counterparty risk that will fail when the physical market seizes. Gold is your insurance policy against systemic failure and the historical anchor that reminds the market what real money is. 2. Bitcoin, the asset of absolute scarcity. The defense. Bitcoin is the 21st century decentralized mathematical response to the fiat printing problem. It is mathematically, algorithmically guaranteed to be absolutely scarce, capped at 21 million units. It exists entirely outside the Eurodollar system, the Fed, and the shadow banking network. It is the ultimate censorship-resistant, decentralized store of value. It is digital, transportable wealth that no government can seize or dilute. Shutterstock. Acquisition strategy. Acquire Bitcoin, BTC, and move it into self-custody, a hardware wallet. Do not leave your BTC on exchanges, which are centralized institutions subject to the same risks as banks. Bitcoin is your engine of future value and your ultimate hedge against the inevitable hyperinflation required to liquidate the global debt. 3. Productive, real assets, the asset of utility and necessity. The defense. When the currency is losing value, the only things that retain true value are assets that possess intrinsic utility and generate income. This means assets that are essential to human survival or industrial function. They provide a cash flow stream that naturally adjusts for inflation as rents and product prices rise with the falling value of the currency. Acquisition strategy. Focus on income-producing farmland, well-maintained rental real estate, purchased with fixed long-term debt to benefit from hyperinflationary debt destruction, and businesses that provide essential services, e.g. local food production, water purification, independent energy. These assets not only hedge inflation, but also provide immediate utility and ongoing cash flow, protecting you from the social and political volatility that follows currency collapse, your next move. This is your final warning. The system is operating on a secret, unsustainable debt mechanism that the central banks lost control of decades ago. The dollar devaluation is not a policy failure. It is the inevitable systemic release of $30+ trillion in unchecked, unbacked offshore debt. The path to protection is clear. Exit the debt system. Own the scarce assets. Do not trust institutions built on borrowed time. Share your skepticism about the official narrative in the comments below and tell us which asset you are prioritizing first. Hit that subscribe button now to join the community dedicated to understanding the unfiltered truth.